Good afternoon from London, and on behalf of the Africa Programme at Chatham House, a very warm welcome to all of you joining us on Zoom and also via Facebook Live. It's a great pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Abebe Aemro Selassie, Director of the Africa Department of the International Monetary Fund, to discuss the future of African development, levers of support through the coronavirus pandemic. This is, in fact, Mr. Selassie's third event with us, so welcome back, Abebe.
Thank you.
Before we start, I just want to give everybody who's watching some guidance. During the presentation, you'll be muted, but after Mr. Selassie has spoken, you'll be able to use the raise hand function during the Q&A session to ask a question live. Please accept my apologies in advance if you don't get to ask a question today. We have a lot of people participating in today's webinar. If you need to, you can submit questions in the Q&A box, and we'll take a few of these, but I do encourage you to use the raise hand function, please, if you can. Also, I do apologize to those joining us via Facebook Live that we won't be able to take questions from you today. We are on the record, so please be aware that as well as using information from the meeting, speakers and other participants may be identified. Please also note that filming and recording of today's event are not allowed, but of course you're welcome to tweet using the hashtag #CHAfrica. And just before we start, a few words about Mr. Selassie. So he's been director of the IMF's Africa department since 2016, a role in which he oversees operations and engagement with 45 countries across sub-Saharan Africa. Prior to this, Mr. Selassie held various senior positions at the IMF, including deputy director of the Africa department, mission chief for Portugal and South Africa, and division chief of the Africa department's regional studies division. Before joining the IMF in 1994, he worked for the government of Ethiopia and for the Economist Intelligence Unit in London. So Abebe, your regional economic outlook for sub-Saharan Africa, which was published in April, paints quite a stark picture of what lies ahead and describes COVID-19 as an unprecedented threat to development. But you do also in that report detail the measures needed to limit the humanitarian and economic losses. So over to you, please, to discuss the outlook and whether the measures you recommend are being pursued and implemented with the requisite urgency. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So yes, indeed, this of course goes without saying has been one of the most challenging, one of the most difficult years, both in terms of the impact socially, the health of people in Africa, but also on our economies. When we were getting together to begin the process of updating our forecasts, the outlook for 2020 in March, we came up with a number of around 1.5%, 1.6% contraction. This is by far the worst reading that we've been able to trace going back to at least 1970. And of course, in per capita terms, per person, this will translate into around a 4% contraction this year. So this is really a very, very severe downward revision to the growth forecast. I mean, we had been projecting the region's economy to expand by around 3.5%. So it's a massive swing to this 1.6% estimate that we came up with. At that time, the expectation was that globally, and in the region itself, the confinement measures, the mitigation measures that countries have been adopting would be limited to around a quarter, followed by a fairly robust recovery. Now, of course, what we're seeing is a slower reopenings, slower rebound. So I would I think, if we were to redo our forecast, as we're bound to in the coming weeks, my sense would be that, we would be looking at an even worse contraction. So the downside risks that we felt were attached to our growth forecasts look to be materializing. So my concern, my worry is that the growth outlook is even worse for this year than we were envisaging in March. So fairly negative picture. What this reflects really is poisonous cocktail of shocks that have hit the region. First and foremost, of course, is the health threat that the outbreak of the pandemic poses to our people, and of course has been taking a heavy toll on people's well-being, on unnecessary deaths, God forbid, God knows. So that's the health shock. Then added to this, of course, has been in terms of the economy, the mitigation containment measures our countries have been very aggressive in adopting, which has suppressed demand very significantly. Basically people are being required to stay at home, not go out, bars needing to close, all manner of restrictions on economic life, which of course is needed to get this disease behind us, to the spread of the disease, control the spread of the disease, but with the attendant economic cost. So that is another aspect of the shock. A third shock, of course, is the decline in external demand, which has been really very severe. I mean, just one example I think would suffice to just demonstrate, how badly the region has been hit from what's going on, which is the tourism sector. I don't know any country that's now in the region which has any tourists to speak of course. So complete devastation for sectors like tourism, hotels, airlines. So again, depressed global activity levels having a very significant bearing on many parts of the region's countries and economies. And then added to all of this for the oil exporting countries, of course, is a slump in oil prices to unprecedentedly low levels. So these, all of these, any one of these shocks would have been difficult enough for any country to contend with. But many countries are contending with 3, if not 4 of these shocks. So that is how profound the challenge to the region's economies has been this year. Almost certainly there will be quite long tails associated with this crisis. Economy-wide, what it will mean is that, of course, we will have a significant output gap relative where countries were expecting to be as a result of the pandemic and the hit to our economies. And of course, why this matters is that people, companies invest with the expectation that growth will continue at a certain level, and now they're going to be looking at an income level, a growth level, an output level that's considerably lower than they had reason to expect when they were doing investments or even consumption decisions. So this significant output loss will be something with us for a long while, even with very rapid growth in many of our countries. Second, of course, there will be some sector-specific long tails as a result of this shock. So, I think sectors like hotel, tourism that I mentioned are going to be impacted, and it may well take them quite a bit of time to recover to their pre-crisis levels of activity and revenue. So this is among the second long tails. And then thirdly, of course, I think we are going to be seeing, we're already beginning to see discussions about, whether countries should be reshoring some critical, the production of some critical stuff like medical supplies, maybe building robust domestic capacity for basic pharmaceuticals, industry kind of things. There are going to be kind of those kind of policy consequences also in terms of the structure of production in our economies. So, while the impact of the crisis, will be short. I mean, in the sense that, hopefully, we will have a vaccine, and this pandemic for sure will be behind us. There are going to be consequences for sectors, but the economy as a whole, as a result of the outbreak and how severe the consequence has been to economies. Two final points I want to make in terms of this period that we're seeing, and very important points. I think the first one is how concerned we are about the asymmetric impact that this crisis is going to have on poor and vulnerable groups. The measures governments have been taking to confine people to their homes, to limit all manner of business activities, are of course going to hurt people who on a daily basis have to go out to earn their livelihoods, be it in the informal sector, driving a taxi, working on a building site, as is the case in many of our countries in the urban areas or even rural areas. Now that you're not being you're being required to stay at home, your ability to put food on the table for your family, your ability to pay rent is going to be, of course, be impacted a lot more than more formal sector activities, which can go on to some degree. So we worry really very much about the inequality consequences about this crisis. And the ramifications it could have, which is why also we've been very aggressive in terms of our policy recommendations for countries to adopt as strongly supportive of a policy stance as possible during this period. The second aspect of this near-term impact is, I'm struck by how widespread, how synchronized, but also sweeping the crisis has been. So no country is being spared. In previous, what we've called global crises, global financial crisis, for example, in the region, what we saw were either countries very reliant on commodity prices or more integrated into global financial markets, global supply chains that were being impacted. In this crisis, almost, I cannot think of a single country that's going to be spared in terms of the difficult cocktail, poisonous cocktail of shocks that are hitting our economy. So every single country is being really hit very, very hard as a result, and every country is feeling the effects of this crisis, including countries with some resilience, with some robustness. Middle-income island economies like Seychelles and Mauritius are being very heavily tourist reliant, are going to be feeling quite a lot of the adverse effects of this crisis. Now, some encouraging news, of course, is that we are seeing more limited spread of the disease COVID-19 so far, touch wood, really, that it stays at this level. But again, I would differentiate between the limited spread of the disease versus the economic impact. The economic impact, of course, has been as severe as elsewhere. Indeed, in some cases, because of countries' limited capacity to absorb the impact of the disease, limited capacity in terms of course, fiscal support, monetary policy support, which is exactly why that we've been calling for significant external support, which I'll come to in a second. But the limited spread is encouraging, and I think we've been attributing this, of course, to demographic factors, to climatic conditions. All of that, I'm sure, is playing a role, but I would not underestimate the impact and the role decisions that policymakers have made either. They were very quick to adopt containment, confinement, mitigation measures when the disease burden was still low. These are not easy decisions to make in the context of our countries, as I noted earlier, but countries did do that. And, really, I think they're to be congratulated whenever they've done that, of course, taken these difficult measures. Also, I think, there's been quite a robust health testing, tracing response in countries. So I think I'm really encouraged by how resilient, to some degree, institutions have proved. And we shouldn't underestimate that side. So I think that's encouraging. And something that positive to look at. On the policy side, our recommendation, very from the bat, was that countries needed to do whatever it took to try and put this crisis behind them. They needed to boost health spending, and importantly, also do social protection. The health side is straightforward, of course. If you don't put this pandemic behind you, if you don't suppress the disease and bring it under the control, there's no economy to worry about. So you could not allow fiscal constraints, considerations, or sustainability considerations to stop you from spending what you need to address this threat. So the health side makes sense. We've been telling countries to really spend whatever it takes. This needs to be coupled with social protection and support, because we're asking people that have to go out on a daily basis to earn a living to stay home. So you have to make up for the income loss they face, and so we've been very, very strongly encouraging countries also to reallocate spending towards social protection at this time. And of course, we have not just been saying to countries to do this, but also stepping forward in a very aggressive manner to provide a significant financial support. We'll have dispersed, I think, something of the order of $16 billion to sub-Saharan African countries in the space of just 6 weeks, 7 weeks. This is, by far the most money we've dispersed as rapidly to the region in our history. So we've been leaning very much forward to provide as much financing as we possibly can, encouraging other entities to also provide as much support as possible. This is, of course, what is behind Managing Director Kristalina and World Bank President David Malpass's call for debt relief from G20 creditors. IMF, of course, has taken the extraordinary step also of providing grants to offset any payments that the poorest 25 countries would have otherwise made to us this year, and we hope to extend that into next year, again, to create fiscal space for countries to spend much needed resources at this time directly on the health and social protection needs that they have. So we've been very, very supportive of a strong fiscal policy, supportive fiscal policy stance this year. Of course, one of the consequences of this is that public debt levels are going to be higher as a result of the crisis. The way we look at this issue, a few thoughts in terms of what the implication all is for public debt. I think first and foremost, we are going to be seeing a lot of countries, really around the world, all countries moving to structurally higher level of public debt. So this is not a phenomenon that's going to be unique to sub-Saharan African countries, or the emerging market universe, but really everybody around the world. Second, debt sustainability is always a medium to long-term issue and can really only be assessed in that context. And yet we are at a point of maximum uncertainty right now in terms of what the outlook for growth for our countries, for commodity prices, for really external trading partners is. So I'm not sure kind of, how much we want to make path-dependent decisions at a time like this, point of maximum uncertainty. So the way we've been approaching this is to look at and see, how much financing countries need, consistent with a reasonable outlook. And over time, the debt challenges that countries will be facing can begin to be addressed over the medium to long term. So this, more or less is how we've been looking at the debt issue that I know you told me that many of your attendees would be interested in. Last point I want to make is, difficult as this crisis has been, I think I also see a lot of scope for optimism going forward. It remains the case that we have by far the youngest region, by far the most dynamic region going forward. It's going to be the region that's going to contribute to at least half of the global working age population by as early as 2030. So a lot of consumption demand, investment demand that's going to be coming from the region, and a lot of source of support and strength for growth in the coming years. So that hopefully will remain unchanged and will be an important source of driver for growth in the region. Second point I want to stress also is that we have seen some important decisions being taken by countries also in the middle of this crisis. I spoke about the boldness that countries have shown in terms of adopting health and containment measures. Those were difficult ones. I think more such bold decisions are needed by countries also. For example, an even bigger push for digitalization. And once the crisis subsides, I think there's going to be a need to tackle the age-old challenge of tax revenue mobilization. Very important, of course, to boost investment in health, for example, something that we found lacking at this time, and much else that higher tax revenues can support of. So all in all, I think a huge, a mammoth task for the region to get out of. But I'm also encouraged by the strong fundamentals that many countries have, and the very promising economic environment that the region has, provided, of course, we are able to tap into it with bold policies. So let me stop there and see if I can answer any questions.
Abebe, thank you so much. I know it's a lot of ground to cover in a short space of time, but thank you for doing so very comprehensively, and also thank you for your notes and the fact that we are seeing African countries show some resilience here, and in large part thanks to early measures taken. And I know there's a distance to go yet. We will move to Q&A now. So as I said, and just a reminder to everybody in case some joined late, that we are on the record today. And as I said at the start, if you could please raise your hands if you'd like to ask a question. We will be prioritizing people by the raise hand function. We'll take as many written questions as we can, but raise hand first. If you're chosen to ask a question, the Africa program team, who are running things with us in the background here, will enable you to unmute yourself. Once that happens, please do unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. When you do that, please introduce yourself both with your name and your affiliation. Please ask a question rather than make a comment. And if you possibly can, please keep it brief. We'd like to take as many questions as possible. So Abebe, if it's okay with you, I will take questions, I think, in clusters of 3. So I'll just go down the list here. So we'll start with Raffaello, then Ali, and then Stephen. So team, if you could let Raffaello ask his question, please. Over to you, Raffaello.
Much, Elizabeth, can you hear me?
A little louder, please, Raffaello, if you could.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Hi, thank you very much, Mr. Selassie, for your very insightful and rich presentation. Raffaello Matarazzo from ENI, who is present in 9 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and among the first producing oil and gas companies. My question is about the coordination among donors and international financing institutions, private creditors, and other international creditors like China in particular. And second point, a question about the countries who are at the moment, who have not received emergency recovery funds, who are asking, like for example, the Republic of Congo, what is the strategy and the approach of the IMF on these kind of countries? Thank you very much.
Do you want me?
Sorry.
Lizzie, do you want me to answer?
I'm so sorry, Abebe, that was my fault. I forgot to unmute myself. I was just asking Ali Maka to ask a question, please. Sorry about that, my apologies. Ali, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation, Mr. Selassie. I'm also from Ethiopia. My affiliation is with the Harvard Kennedy School. And there was a news report this week from the WHO that said because of the demographic structure in Africa, only 4% of the population being over 65 years of age, not having a lot of the comorbidities that have led to the significant fatality rates in Europe and in North America, that although the disease would spread rapidly and a lot of people would be infected, they didn't expect the fatality rate to mirror those in Europe and in North America and elsewhere. And it doesn't seem like African countries, granted you said that they had taken some quick measures to contain this disease, that the separation, social distancing, testing capacity is there to deal with this crisis. It may take the form of herd immunity rather than the kinds of approaches that have been taken in Europe and North America to be able to handle this. And given the demographic structure, the fatality rate might not be so significant. And so the public health measures might need to be contained to protect those vulnerable segments of the population, maybe 4% of the population, instead of the 96% that are under 50 years of age or under 40 years of age. But my question is, every crisis is also an opportunity. What can African countries do in terms of restructuring the economy now to kind of take advantage of this period and see what opportunities there may be in terms of providing like PPE equipment, simple gowns and so on in terms of the manufacturing sector? And what can the IMF do to kind of help these countries move in these kinds of new opportunities and segments? That would be my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much there. And the last question for this round from Stephen Hurt, please.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, thanks very much for the presentation. My name's Stephen Hurt. I'm a reader in international relations at Oxford Brookes University in the UK. I just wanted to, it follows a little bit from the last question. I just wanted to pick up on the point about pharmaceuticals and a possible vaccine that you touched on in your presentation. And I just wondered what your view was on the kind of prospects for Africa in terms of potential access, if and when, let's hope when, a vaccine becomes available? And in particular, is there a need, do you think, for specific licensing arrangements so that we can have the kind of generic production that you were hinting at in your presentation? Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Okay, Abebe, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thanks. So, in terms of coordination amongst countries, international institutions, I know people, so just one very encouraging thing that happened in terms of support for the region is the fact that the discussion on debt relief took place at the level of the G20 group of countries. This is a really very, very important initiative because it's a group that not only includes traditional Paris Club members, but also new creditor countries like Saudi Arabia, new official creditor countries like China, Brazil, and the like. So it was really, really very good to see the decision being taken at the G20 level. And really, for me, it was a very encouraging sign of traditional Paris Club creditors and others coming together to recognize the moment and the support that low-income countries, developing countries needed at this time. So that's an encouraging sign, one that needs to be built on, surely, but that's very encouraging. At the level of entities like the IMF, I can tell you that, we've been interacting so much with the World Health Organization, but also other, international organizations like we've never done before. The moment calls for it. It's really incumbent on multilateral institutions to really come together and as a system of entities to work with each other. So we've been really, in the vanguard, try and work as collaboratively as possible with other multilateral development banks on things, it's not really directly in our area of expertise, but encouraging them to find ways in which they can work together, for example, in terms of the procurement of supplies for countries. So, you have bulk purchasing power, so quite a lot of coordination. On those countries to whom we haven't provided support yet, I mean, so far from the 45 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that I oversee, we've provided support for 36 countries. We had a total request from around 41, 42. So for the other 5-6 countries, we are in the process of trying to find ways forward. Some of the difficulty relates to, in some cases, arrears that they have to other multilateral entities, and we are constrained from lending, so we're trying to work with international other entities to provide grant support into the budget and the like. And then there are other cases, with a few cases where debt is unsustainable, and we need to see that there is a path towards sustainability before we can lend. And the reason why this is so important, of course, is that when debt is unsustainable, and if the fund was to put in new financing, the problem, of course, is that this money would go towards servicing that debt and not helping countries directly. So we want to make sure that the resources that we're providing will be for the health needs, for the social protection needs countries have. On this issue about the reason for the lower spread being on account of population, the younger population demographics in the region, etc. I've also looked and read those studies. Frankly, I read them more to try and understand better what's going on in our region. Not being an epidemiologist, I don't want to second guess the decisions, the policy choices that governments have made in terms of combating the disease. There's quite a lot of expertise, advice that's coming from, domestic epidemiologists, but also international best practices that countries are trying to balance. So we've just been trying to understand what's going on and not wanting to second guess on that side. The economic side is difficult enough without us kind of trying to figure out what's going on. So we've seen arguments on both sides. In terms of, what countries can do to restructure their economies, absolutely. Every crisis, as is often said, offers an opportunity to do things differently. As I said earlier, I think one of the big things that we've seen at a time like this, is, for example, how important the push for digitalization is. You just have to look at the kind of modality in which we're communicating, and I've been doing much the same thing with a lot of with a lot of people in the region, of course, creating different ways of doing work, facilitating work, but also the value of digitalization in terms of providing social protection. We saw the initiative in Togo where they're using mobile money balances to try and identify and target people to whom to do social transfers. I had a minister from West African country, tell me that, this has convinced him like nothing else about how important it is to try and move to digitalization instead of using hard currencies, because he's afraid to touch currency in case it has disease on it. So there are opportunities, there are things that policies can facilitate, including in the pharmaceutical area. Maybe it does make sense for countries to have some degree of control on the provision of basic supplies in medicines and supplies, the PPE that you noted. But I think I'm hesitant to be for the IMF or people outside to be telling countries these are the areas you want to invest in, etc. One last, I think, really important thing in terms of restructuring and new way of thinking that's needed also is really vis-a-vis climate change. What, for me, above everything else, what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown is that, these things that we consider tail events that will not, are far off events, do happen. It's why I think, policies need to really be geared with an eye to all of the threats that climate change poses to our countries also, internalizing them and thinking as we're doing projects anew about the potential implications of climate change is, I think, one of the big takeaways for me. And I think that's also another frame of mind, which I think would be really helpful for our countries to take. On the vaccine licensing issues, I think, again, what's really striking about this pandemic really is that how we're all in this together, and how important it is to stamp out this disease everywhere, because if you don't, sure enough, the threat to even countries in the advanced world is going to remain there. I mean, we saw that earlier in Ebola case. We're seeing it now, the disease coming into Africa. So I really hope the various initiatives that we've seen by European countries, the WHO, various other health foundations, to make sure that there is a way in which the vaccine will be replicated, will be licensed and made available globally, is going to be really, really, really important. I think it's in the strongest public interest globally that this is done. Without it, really, again, we're going to almost certainly we're going to be in a situation where both this disease and others that are going to come later continue to spread. So I do hope that common sense prevails and this is made available cheaply and readily for countries in our region.
Thank you very much, Abebe. Okay, I'm going to take another round from the raised hand list here, and I am going to hop around it a little bit. So for this round, I'll take Carlos Lopez, Lucy Heinz, and Nkorti Boni, please. And the next round, we do have some questions coming in through the Q&A function as well, but we'll get to those. So next round, please, Carlos, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Abebe. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. I'm doing it today on my capacity as Associate Fellow of the Africa Program of Chatham House. And my question to you is very simple. We know that there is a public debt problem that is worldwide. It's not just African. So how is the IMF going to enter into a discussion about the measurement of debt sustainability? You said yourself that we are going to enter into a year that is quite exceptional, that will not be able to accommodate the normal way we actually understand debt sustainability. So I just wanted you to elaborate on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Lucy, if you'd like to ask your question, please. Thank you. Lucy, have we got you? Sorry, bear with us, please. Okay, what I'll do is, Nkurati, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Thank you, Lizzie, and thank you, Mr. Selassie, for your presentation. My name is Nkurati Laiboni. I'm a fellow at the Africa program at Chatham House. I do agree with your observation that African governments have been quite quick to respond to the pandemic and have shown a lot of resilience. But I think that the story that's not being talked about at the moment, at least from my observation, is the resilience that individuals and communities are showing at the grassroots level. For instance, I'm in Nairobi at the moment. We are seeing here in Kenya, Uber drivers who've been impacted by the government's stay-at-home directives, selling vegetables and fruits by the roadside at the booths of their cars. So I just wondered what your reading is on how individuals and communities are adapting to the shocks that you just mentioned. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Nkurati. And Christopher Smith, please.
Yes, thank you very much for taking my question. I'm asking the question on behalf of the German Council on Foreign Relations on the Africa Program on Crisis Prevention and Diplomacy. And my specific question is, how can development partners and IMF board members support the macroeconomic adjustments that need to be made beyond the postponement of debt payments? So what other specific measures besides debt payments can development partners take to support the nations in sub-Saharan Africa? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Christopher. Okay, Abebe, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. As always, penetrating question. Look, as I said, we first and foremost, completely see that we're going to be moving to an era of structurally higher debt across the world for sovereigns. Second, the issue with debt pressures in our countries has not been about the level of debt to GDP. It's not been that one, but rather the flow indicators. So it's been more interest payment as a share of tax revenues that has often been the pinching point and the source of great pressure on our countries. So third point I want to make is, in terms of how we need to rethink about this, what we are seeing, what we continue to see globally, of course, is that despite debt levels going up in many advanced countries, for example, the amount of interest payments that they have to make has been going negative or lower and lower. To the point, this morning I was seeing on the news, the UK government, I think for the first time, issued gilts at negative interest rates for 3 years, despite, what's been going on to the debt stock. Given the structure of borrowing for our countries, which of course, because of the limited domestic market size, limited domestic savings that are available, borrowing tends to be from abroad. More generally, investment tends to outstrip savings, in our countries. So investment demand is always high, consumption demand is high. So interest rates have not been going down in our countries. So we have all of these issues to try to take into account. In the fund, what we've been doing, as I suggested earlier, is first and foremost, try and not to take path-dependent decisions right now when markets are dislocated, when there's so much uncertainty about the outlook for growth in the countries and abroad. So we've been saying, okay, let's see how things play out over the next few years, and we are continuing to lend on that basis. So, and this will also give us time to take into account all of the developments that we're seeing around the world, financially, growth-wise, and then we'll figure out what the way forward is. On the response of individuals and communities, I have to say, kind of, I've been reading, news accounts of these kind of endeavors. I mean, absolutely. I think one of the things that is often underestimated, not enough taken into account, is how resilient our countries are, our people are. At the same time, I do so wish that we didn't have to rely on people's resilience, and had a way in which, particularly at times like this, we could so quickly provide support without too much dislocation. So that's the only comment I can make on that point. And then on what the international community can do, I think the biggest thing the international community can and has to do right now is to provide as much external financing, ideally in of course, grant form, ideally in very, very low, highly concessional terms. But really, the volume of support right now is going to be so important. Why? Companies and countries really need room, the space to be able to have some policies to avoid the disruptions, the dislocation that this disease is causing. Compare what many G7 countries, many emerging market countries, and large emerging market countries have been able to do in terms of fiscal support for their economies, for their companies, for their enterprises. Compare that to a very constrained response so far fiscally that countries have been able to do. All of the fiscal widening in the region that we've seen is really a defensive measure, basically countries just accommodating the decline in revenues, and not enough, more positive injection of support by way of, not enough certainly, support by way of social protection, by way of support to companies. There's been some forgiveness of or delay in tax payments, etc., but nowhere near enough compared to, for example, what many G7 countries are doing. And the reason, of course, why the support has been limited is that the amount of the available fiscal space, the available financing is not there. So I think a big support that the international community needs to do really is to provide countries with very significant resources to cope with this downturn, but as importantly, to support the recovery in the next few years. Absent that, I worry that the growth trajectories of our countries will not be as good as it can be.
Thank you, Abebe. Okay, I'm going to take a few questions here that have come in writing. We've one from Jean-Ami Nobola, who asks about the diaspora contribution. How is it that the diaspora can support the response as Africa navigates its way through the pandemic? Another question from Claire von Lusker. Discussions on traditional IMF programs, such as ETF, SBA, etc., have been put on hold in order to prioritize RCF and RFI disbursements. When does the IMF expect to resume discussions for these types of programs, namely in countries such as Kenya and Mozambique? What are the prospects for RCF disbursement in Zambia? And I'll take this one from Bukuru Jean-Baptiste. Taking into account the vulnerability of African economies depending on imports of many basic products, will this crisis have any negative or also positive impact on rethinking regional integration in Africa in order to put together efforts and achieve real cooperation to mitigate effects and possible future challenges? I think that's enough for now. There's one more I may come back to, but let's start with those. Thank you, Abebe.
Thank you. So in terms of what the diaspora can do, I think the diaspora in all our countries has been a very important source of the transfer of knowledge, remittance flows, and the like to our countries. Of course, right now, the ability for people to go back home to, whether permanently or temporarily, is heavily constrained. So perhaps one thing we can all do is continue to send the remittances that are such an important source of support for our countries. And of course, other endeavors. I mean, I've had friends across the region that have been active in trying to provide PPE supplies to send back home and the like. And I think all those endeavors are important. I mean, we really shouldn't underestimate individual agency either, as we were discussing a little earlier. So everything we can do to support our families back home is important. On discussions on ECFs that have been put on hold. So, our whole approach really has been this, to try and find the quickest route to support countries at this time. So in those cases where, program discussions were well advanced, we used that as a vehicle to do disbursements. But in many cases, what was the easier thing to do, given there was so much uncertainty about the trajectory of economic recovery, was to put the discussions under existing programs on hold and use our rapid disbursement rapidly dispersing facilities to provide support to countries. So, in terms of when we can revert back to program discussions, it really will depend on country-specific circumstances. In both the case of Kenya and Mozambique, we didn't have, and Zambia for that matter, we didn't have any programs. But there were discussions that were ongoing, so those really have not stopped. But for Mozambique and Kenya, we were able to move very quickly forward to provide disbursements under the rapid dispersing facilities, because the resources are needed now. And when we are able to have discussions, in a more structured way, we will do so. Suffice it to say that if there are any financing gaps, we're not going to wait, or financing needs that we can cover, we're not going to wait until there is an ECF program, etc. We will continue to provide that financing through whatever modality while we are in this acute phase of the crisis. With respect to Zambia, we have not been able to proceed forward because, heading into this crisis, the debt situation in Zambia was very, very difficult. And we needed assurance that that debt situation was going to be addressed. Government is in the process of addressing that right now, and once that process is well underway, we're hoping that to be able to provide support to Zambia. Regional integration, again, really one of the most encouraging developments globally, really, to come out in recent years, of course, has been the AFCFTA. I so hope that that momentum is not going to be impacted by what's going on in the region right now. So, I think really, I see that in any event as more of a medium to long-term initiative to which we have to work towards. So I really, really do hope, consistent with what I was saying earlier about a greener development future that our countries have, in terms of the investments that we need to make. I hope that countries continue to prioritize those projects that are going to be linking our region a lot more, those initiatives that are going to facilitate production for our domestically, but also neighboring countries. So I think keeping the eye on the ball there is going to be really, really important. And any policy interventions that are needed to be taken up. On this point, I want to just say one quick thing, which is I've been so pleased and encouraged by the collective leadership that has been shown by the region. Leaders were very quick to appoint these envoys from the Africa Union towards the international community to be a voice for the region in terms of the financing needs. to participate in some of the debt initiatives that are taking place. So I think it's the same kind of initiative that we saw in the creation of the AFCFTA that has sustained this engagement. And I think, I'm really encouraged by that, and we need to sustain that momentum.
Thank you, Abebe. We are 2 minutes to time, so if you'll indulge us a little bit so we can overrun slightly, I'd like to take just one more round of questions.
I have a hard stop at 10:30, but yeah, I can try. And
you have a hard stop?
Yes.
Okay.
10:30.
I'm just going to take, in that case, let's just call on Thomas Stefan. If you could just very quickly ask your question, and then we'll close. Thank you, Thomas.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I'm a pastor from Bread for the World, the German Protestant development agency. And we're talking only about investment and green investment, push for digitalization, but it all follows the same model of capitalistic future and thinking. My question is there any place for alternative models of growth with also living in the planetary boundaries? And can sustainable development only be mean economic growth? Or is there the opportunity for rethinking how we want to live together on this planet, not only in this models of constant economic growth, because it's normal that no system in this universe can ever grow constantly. So this is my question of alternative models. Thank you very much. And thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Thomas. So I think a nice question to finish on, and any last comments from you before we close. Thank you.
What I can say is, if this pandemic doesn't give us all pause to stop and reflect and think about how we have to try and do things differently, I don't know what else will. So should this include, different models of economic development? I don't see why not. I have to say, in terms of what I'm doing, what we're doing as an institution, we're very much engaged in the now, but with a frame of mind that all the stuff that we're doing now, all the work support we're providing, has to be kind of no regrets interventions, as Stefan Derkon has put it. Interventions that will be supportive of various states of the world that we may be coming out to at the end of this pandemic. And this is why we're focusing so much on preserving lives, preserving livelihoods, so that you don't have some of the persistence effects that deep shocks like this can have on people's lives and people's well-beings. Okay.
Abebe, thank you so much. We really appreciate you spending this time with us. Thank you to our viewers on Zoom and on Facebook. And we, of course, will continue with our Africa Programme webinars. Abebe, grateful thanks.